Margaret Holt pushed her shopping cart through the automatic doors of Cedar Valley Market, her weekly ritual complete except for one forgotten item: cat food for Mr. Whiskers, her neighbor's ancient tabby she watched while Mrs. Henderson visited, her daughter in Chicago. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as she loaded her groceries into the back of her aging Honda Civic, mentally organizing her evening plans around grading the latest batch of library science assignments from the community college extension program she taught on weekends. A sharp clatter from behind made her turn around. An elderly man stood beside a rusted pickup truck, canned goods scattered across the asphalt around his feet. His paper grocery bag had torn completely open, spilling its contents everywhere. The man himself looked exhausted, his pale skin almost translucent in the dying sunlight, and his clothes hung loose on his thin frame like they belonged to someone much larger. "Oh no, let me help you with that," Margaret called out, abandoning her own cart to hurry over. The old man looked up with the most unusual eyes she had ever seen, a deep violet color that seemed to catch and hold light in impossible ways. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and a sharp jawline that made him look aristocratic despite his obviously difficult circumstances. "You need not trouble yourself, young lady," he said, his voice carrying a strange formal accent she could not place. "I am quite capable of managing this small disaster on my own." Margaret was already kneeling on the pavement, gathering up cans of expensive imported salmon and packages of what looked like premium cuts of meat wrapped in butcher paper. Nonsense, everyone needs help sometimes. Besides, some of these cans rolled pretty far. She noticed his hands as he bent to help her, long fingers with what appeared to be thick yellowed nails, and skin that felt surprisingly warm when their fingers accidentally touched while reaching for the same can. The contact sent an odd, tingling sensation up her arm that she dismissed as static electricity from the dry autumn air. "These are some interesting choices," she commented, reading labels on various exotic spices and specialty items. "Saffron, dragon's breath pepper blend, imported yak butter. Are you a chef?" The old man, who had introduced himself simply as Aldrich, paused in his gathering. "I have particular dietary requirements that are somewhat difficult to satisfy in this modern age. The foods I once enjoyed are no longer readily available." Margaret helped him load everything into a new paper bag from her own supply. "I noticed you were having trouble at checkout earlier. I was behind you in line." She had watched him count and recount a small collection of crumpled bills and loose change, ultimately having to put several items back. "How about I grab a few more things for you, my treat?" Aldrich straightened up slowly, and for a moment Margaret could have sworn he looked much taller than she remembered. "That is extraordinarily kind, but I could not possibly accept such generosity from a stranger." "Well, then we won't be strangers," Margaret replied with the easy warmth that made her popular with both library patrons and students. "I'm Margaret Holt. I run the Cedar Falls Public Library and teach part-time at the community college. What's your name?" "I am called Aldrich, though I have had many names over the years." He studied her face with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable. "It has been a very long time since anyone has shown such kindness to an old wanderer like myself. Tell me, Margaret Holt, what drives you to help someone you do not know?" The question caught her off guard. Most people simply accepted help when offered without analyzing the motivation behind it. "I don't know. Really, I suppose I was raised to believe that we're all connected somehow. When someone needs help and you can provide it, you do. That's just how things should work." Aldrich nodded slowly, a philosophy that was once more common than it is today. "You have an old soul, Margaret Holt." They walked back into the store together, where Margaret added several more expensive items to Aldrich's collection: prime cuts of beef, exotic spices, and even a bottle of aged wine she noticed him eyeing earlier. The total came to nearly $200, which would definitely impact her monthly budget. But something about the old man's quiet dignity made her want to help at the checkout counter. Aldrich watched the cashier scan each item with an expression of growing amazement. "I find myself in your debt," he said quietly. "This level of generosity toward a stranger is rare in any age." "Don't mention it," Margaret replied, though she noticed the cashier giving them both curious looks. Everyone deserves a good meal. As they loaded the groceries into Aldrich's truck, she could not help but notice how carefully he handled each item. Almost reverently, the meat packages, especially, seemed to hold his attention, and she caught him inhaling deeply as if savoring some anticipated feast. "Margaret," Aldrich said, as they finished loading the last bag, "I must give you something in return. It would not be proper for such kindness to go unmarked." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something small that he pressed into her palm, a stone pendant carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift and move in the changing light. The stone itself was warm to the touch and felt heavier than it should given its size. "This is too much," she protested. "I can't accept something that looks so valuable." "It is a token of gratitude from one who remembers debts," Aldrich replied firmly. "And I always remember my debts, Margaret Holt. Please keep it safe, it may prove useful someday." The way he said those words sent a small shiver down her spine, but she slipped the pendant into her jacket pocket anyway. There was something about the old man that made arguing seem pointless. "Will I see you around town?" she asked. "Maybe at the library. I have an excellent cookbook collection if you're interested in trying new recipes." Aldrich smiled, and for a moment his teeth seemed unusually sharp in the fluorescent light of the parking lot. "Perhaps you will see more of me than you expect, though I hope when that time comes, you will remember this moment with kindness." He climbed into his truck with surprising agility for someone who had seemed so frail just minutes earlier. As he drove away, Margaret stood in the parking lot holding her own car keys, wondering why she felt like she had just participated in something much more significant than a simple grocery shopping trip. The pendant in her pocket seemed to pulse with a warmth of its own, and she found herself looking forward to examining it more closely once she got home. Little did she know that her simple act of kindness had just set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the fate of 2 entire species. 3 evenings later, Margaret sat curled up in her favorite armchair with a mystery novel and a cup of chamomile tea, trying to shake off the strange dreams that had been plaguing her since her encounter with Aldrich. Every night brought the same vivid images. Vast creatures with scales that gleamed like polished metal soaring through star-filled skies, their wings casting shadows over entire cities. The dreams felt too real to be mere fantasy, filled with sights and sounds and even smells that her imagination should not have been able to conjure. The pendant Aldrich had given her rested on the coffee table nearby, its carved surface seeming to shimmer with its own inner light whenever she looked at it directly. She had tried researching the symbols online but found nothing that matched the intricate patterns. A low humming sound from outside interrupted her reading. At first she thought it might be the neighbor's new generator, but the sound was too smooth, too musical. It rose and fell in complex harmonies that seemed to resonate in her bones, rather than just her ears. Margaret set down her book and moved to the front window, pushing aside the curtains to peer out into the darkness. Her blood ran cold. The entire street was bathed in an eerie blue-white glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tall figures in dark, form-fitting armor moved with mechanical precision between the houses, their movements synchronized like some elaborate military operation. Each carried what looked like a scanning device that projected thin beams of light as they examined every surface. Margaret's neighbors were nowhere to be seen, though she could see lights on in their windows. The figures had cordoned off the entire block with some kind of shimmering barrier that distorted the air like heat waves rising from summer pavement. One of the armored beings turned in her direction, and she jumped back from the window, her heart pounding. The thing's face was hidden behind a reflective visor, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, with limbs that were slightly too long for a human frame. Her phone had no signal. The landline produced only static. Even her internet connection was dead. Margaret tried to convince herself this was some kind of elaborate prank or maybe a military exercise, but the professional efficiency of the figures outside suggested something far more serious. She had read enough science fiction to recognize the signs, even if her rational mind refused to accept the implications. A sharp knock at her front door made her freeze. The sound was perfectly measured. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks, pause, then 3 final knocks. It was clearly some kind of protocol, formal and precise. "Margaret Holt," came a voice from outside. The words were in perfect English, but the tone was flat and emotionless, like a computer-generated speech. "You are required to present yourself for questioning. Please open your door and step outside." Margaret pressed herself against the wall beside the window, trying to think. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone, which still showed no signal bars. "Margaret Holt." The voice repeated, "We are aware of your presence. Please comply with our instructions. Resistance will be noted and reported to the appropriate authorities." "What authorities?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's this about?" "I haven't done anything wrong. You have been observed engaging in prohibited contact with an exiled entity. This interaction represents a violation of established protocols. Your cooperation in our investigation is not optional." Margaret's mind raced back to her encounter with Aldrich at the grocery store. Exiled entity, prohibited contact. None of this made any sense, but the evidence was literally standing outside her door. She grabbed the pendant from the coffee table and slipped it into her pocket, some instinct telling her it might be important. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door. The figure standing on her porch was definitely not human. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with proportions that were subtly wrong in ways that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them. The dark armor appeared to be made of some material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating the disturbing effect of a person-shaped hole in reality. "I am Interrogator Venth of the Oversight Division," the being said through what was obviously some kind of translation device. "You will accompany us for processing and evaluation." "Processing for what?" Margaret demanded, surprised by her own boldness. "I'm an American citizen. I have rights. You can't just take me without—" "Your species' local legal frameworks do not apply in this matter," Venth interrupted. "You have interfered with the lawful exile of a dangerous criminal. This requires immediate attention from higher authorities." The interrogator gestured with one long arm, and a holographic display materialized in the air between them. Margaret gasped as she watched herself on the projection, helping Aldrich gather his scattered groceries, and later paying for his food at the checkout counter. "The entity you assisted is known as Pyrion the Burnished, last survivor of the Golden Flight clan. He was exiled to this world 500 of your years ago for crimes against the natural order. Your assistance to him represents a violation of interstellar law." Margaret stared at the projection, trying to process what she was seeing. That's impossible. He's just an old man who needed help with groceries. This has to be some kind of mistake. There is no mistake. Margaret Holt. The entity known as Pyrion is a Class 7 reality manipulator whose presence on any civilized world represents an unacceptable risk. Your interaction with him has created what your legal systems would call an incident. More armored figures appeared around her house, moving with that same eerie synchronization. They carried devices that hummed with barely contained energy, and Margaret did not need anyone to tell her they were weapons. "You will board our transport vessel," Venth continued. "You will answer questions about your interaction with the exile. You will submit to standard processing procedures. Compliance will result in more favorable treatment." Margaret looked around at the armed figures surrounding her, home, at the alien technology that had cut off her entire neighborhood from the outside world, at the impossible situation she had somehow stumbled into by doing nothing more than helping an elderly man with his groceries. "And if I refuse?" She asked. "Refusal is not an option for beings of your classification level," Venth replied. "However, your cooperation or lack thereof will be noted in our report to the Draconic Council. That notation may influence their final judgment regarding your fate." The Draconic Council. The governing body that oversees interactions between higher order beings and developing species such as your own. They will determine what consequences your actions have earned. Margaret felt the pendant growing warm in her pocket, almost as if it were responding to her rising fear and anger. Despite her terror, she found herself thinking about the old man at the grocery store. His formal way of speaking, his unusual eyes, the way he had seemed to grow taller when he straightened up. If he really was some kind of exiled alien being, Then he had been hungry, and alone, and she had helped him. That could not possibly be a crime, no matter what these creatures claimed about interstellar law. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "I'll come with you. But I want it on record that I don't regret helping someone who needed help. And if that's against your laws, then maybe your laws need to be reconsidered." Venth tilted his head in what might have been surprise. "Your species continues to demonstrate remarkable stubbornness in the face of overwhelming odds. This trait will be noted in our assessment." A sleek transport vessel descended from the night sky, its hull reflecting the streetlights like polished obsidian. As Margaret was escorted toward it, she caught a glimpse of her neighbors watching from their windows, their faces pale with shock and confusion. Whatever was happening to her, she realized, they could see it too. This was real, and there was no going back to her quiet life of books and tea and peaceful evenings. The pendant in her pocket pulsed with warmth, and she found herself hoping that wherever they were taking her, she would see Aldrich again. If she was going to face judgment for helping him, she at least wanted to know why such a simple act of kindness had turned her world upside down. The interior of the transport vessel defied every expectation Margaret had formed about alien technology. Instead of cold metal corridors and blinking lights, she found herself in what appeared to be a crystalline garden suspended in space walls, of translucent material curved overhead like the inside of a massive geode, their surfaces alive with slowly shifting patterns of light that reminded her of Aurora Borealis. Venth guided her through chambers filled with impossible geometries, rooms where the floor became the ceiling without any apparent transition, corridors that seemed to stretch for miles but required only a few steps to traverse. The air itself hummed with energy that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. "Your species perceives only a fraction of dimensional reality," Venth explained, when he noticed her confusion. "Our vessels exist in multiple spatial layers simultaneously. What you see is merely the projection your mind can process without suffering permanent damage." They emerged into a vast amphitheater that took Margaret's breath away. The space was so enormous she could not see the far walls, with a vaulted ceiling that seemed to contain actual stars. The floor beneath her feet appeared to be made of polished obsidian that reflected not her image, but glimpses of other places and times. At the center of the amphitheater, 5 massive forms waited in judgment. Margaret had thought she was prepared for anything after her encounter with the armored beings, but nothing could have readied her for the sight of the Draconic Council in their true forms. Each creature was easily the size of a city building, with scales that shifted color like oil on water, and eyes that burned with inner fire. The central figure spoke directly into her mind, its voice resonating through her bones. "Human child, you stand accused of interfering with the lawful exile of one who has been cast out from our kind. Do you understand the gravity of what you have done?" Margaret struggled to find her voice in the face of such overwhelming presence. "I helped an old man with his groceries, that's all I did. I don't understand how that could be a crime." A second dragon, its scales deep emerald shot through with veins of gold, leaned forward. "The being you call Aldrich was once known as Pirion the Burnished. He was exiled from our society for the crime of mercy, for refusing to destroy a settlement of your ancestors during what your history calls the Dark Ages." He was exiled for showing mercy. Margaret felt a flash of anger that surprised her with its intensity. What kind of society punishes someone for refusing to kill innocent people? The kind of society that has maintained order in this galaxy for 50,000 years, the third dragon replied, its mental voice carrying undertones of frost. "We do not interfere with lesser species because such interference inevitably leads to dependence and stagnation. Your kind must rise or fall on your own merits." The fourth dragon, smallest of the 5 but still immense beyond comprehension, projected what felt like amusement. "Yet here stands a human who dares question the wisdom of beings older than her species' written history. Perhaps Pirion's assessment of your kind's potential was not entirely without merit." Margaret forced herself to stand straighter, even though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "I don't care how old or wise you are, if you punish kindness and mercy, then your wisdom is incomplete." The fifth dragon had remained silent until now, but its mental voice carried the weight of eons when it finally spoke. "Show us this token of gratitude that Pyrian gave you, human child." We sense its resonance from. Here Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her pocket. The pendant felt almost hot now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She pulled it out and held it up, watching the carved symbols glow with increasing brightness. "A debt stone," the central dragon observed. "He has bound himself to your service through the ancient laws of obligation. This complicates matters considerably." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. The emerald dragon shifted, its massive form creating small earthquakes in the amphitheater's structure. "It means that by accepting his token you have entered into a sacred compact. Any harm that comes to you reflects upon his honor. The debt can only be discharged through mutual agreement or your death." "That's barbaric, that. Is tradition?" The frost dragon corrected one that has governed dragon society since before your son was born. "The debt must be addressed before any judgment can be rendered." Margaret felt the pieces falling into place. "So you can't just execute me or wipe my memory because it would dishonor him." "Precisely. And Pyrian, despite his exile, remains a being of ancient lineage. His dishonor would reflect upon all of dragonkind." The smallest dragon projected what definitely felt like amusement. "Now you begin to understand, human child. Your simple act of kindness has created a web of obligation that even we cannot easily dismiss." Margaret looked up at the 5 massive creatures surrounding her, beings of unimaginable power and age, and realized she held more leverage in this situation than anyone had expected. "Then I invoke whatever rights come with this debt. What are my options?" The central dragon's eyes flared brighter. "Interesting. You do not beg for mercy or claim ignorance. You demand to know your legal standing. This suggests intelligence despite your species' youth. Very well." The emerald dragon continued. "Under ancient law you have 4 choices. First, accept immediate execution and release Pyrian from his debt. Second, submit to memory modification and return to your world with no recollection of these events. Third, face trial by combat to prove your worth as his creditor. Fourth, accept exile alongside him and share his punishment." "What about a 5th option?" Margaret asked. The dragons exchanged glances that somehow conveyed entire conversations. "Explain." "Trial by advocacy," Margaret said, drawing on her knowledge of legal systems, both human and historical. "I demand the right to speak in defense of Pyrian's character and to present evidence that his original punishment was unjust." The silence that followed was so complete, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the vast chamber. "Trial by advocacy has not been invoked in over 3,000 years. The frost dragon finally responded. "It requires the accused to be present to accept or decline such representation. Then bring him here. You would stake your life on defending one you have known for mere moments." Margaret thought about the old man struggling with his groceries, about the dignity with which he had carried himself despite obvious hardship, about the gratitude in his unusual violet eyes when she had simply treated him with basic human kindness. "Yes," she said firmly. "I would." The smallest dragon projected. What might have been approval summoned the exile. Let him hear this human's offer and decide if he will accept her advocacy. The air in the center of the amphitheater began to shimmer and fold, and Margaret held her breath as reality bent around the arrival of someone she now knew was far more than just a lonely old man who needed help with his groceries. The pendant in her hand grew so warm it was almost painful, and she realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her fate, but possibly the future relationship between 2 species that were only just beginning to understand each other. The shimmer in the air solidified into a figure that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Aldrich stood before the council, but this was not the frail elderly man she had helped at the grocery store. This was Pyrian the Burnished in his true form. Still humanoid, but clearly not human. With skin that held an inner luminescence and eyes that burned like violet stars. His presence filled the space around him with barely contained power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. He looked directly at Margaret, and she saw surprise flicker across his ancient features. "You summoned me to face this human's accusation," he said, his mental voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast age and accumulated wisdom. "What crime does she claim I have committed?" The central dragon's response rumbled through the amphitheater. "She claims no crime. Exile. She offers to serve as your advocate and argues that your original punishment was unjust." Pyrion turned to study Margaret with those incredible eyes. "You would risk your life to defend someone you barely know. This is either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness, maybe both," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady in the face of his transformed presence. "But I know enough you were punished for refusing to destroy innocent people. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. And what do you know of dragon law? Human child. What makes you think you can argue before beings who have dispensed justice since before your species learned to make fire?" Margaret felt her librarian instincts kicking in, the same methodical approach she used when helping patrons research complex topics. "I know that any legal system worth respecting must be based on consistent principles. I know that justice requires examining not just the letter of the law but its spirit. And I know that sometimes an outsider's perspective can reveal flaws that those inside the system can't see." The emerald dragon leaned forward. "You speak of principles, human. What principles guide your species' concept of justice?" "Growth," Margaret said without hesitation. "Learning compassion. The idea that we become better by helping each other rather than by standing alone. Our greatest achievements come from cooperation, not isolation, and you believe these principles apply to beings far older and more advanced than yourselves. I believe good principles are universal," Margaret replied. "Age and power don't make someone immune to mistakes. In fact, they might make it harder to recognize when you're wrong because everyone around you is too afraid to disagree." A sound that might have been laughter echoed from the smallest dragon. "She has courage, this one. Perhaps more courage than wisdom, but courage nonetheless." Pyrion stepped closer to Margaret, his presence washing over her like standing near a bonfire. "You truly wish to serve as my advocate even knowing that failure will likely mean your death." Margaret looked up at him, remembering the gratitude in his eyes when she had simply treated him with kindness. "You've been alone for 500 years, punished for doing the right thing. If no one else will speak for you, then yes, I will." "Very well," Pyrion said, inclining his head formally. "I accept your advocacy. Margaret Holt, may whatever wisdom you possess serve us both." The central dragon's mental voice carried undertones of anticipation. "The compact is formed. The human will present her case for the exile's redemption. The council will hear her arguments and render judgment." Margaret took a deep breath and stepped forward, drawing on every skill she had learned from years of research and teaching. "Honored council, I want to talk about the nature of wisdom and the true purpose of dragon society." "Proceed." "You've told me that dragons don't interfere with lesser species because interference leads to dependence and stagnation. But what if the opposite is true? What if isolation leads to stagnation and interaction leads to growth?" The frost dragon's mental voice carried sharp interest. "Explain this theory." Margaret began pacing, the way she did when delivering lectures. "In my work as a librarian, I've studied the development of human civilization. Our greatest advances always came from contact with other cultures. Trade, exchange of ideas, even conflict that forced us to adapt. When societies cut themselves off from outside influence, they become rigid and start to decline. You compare dragon society to human history. This seems presumptuous." "I'm comparing universal principles," Margaret replied. "Growth requires challenge, wisdom requires new perspectives, even the strongest muscle atrophies without use." She turned to address Pyrion directly. "You were exiled for refusing to destroy a human settlement 500 years ago. What happened to that settlement after you spared it?" Pyrion's eyes flared brighter. "It grew into a city. It became a center of learning and culture. The knowledge preserved there helped spark what humans call the Renaissance." Margaret spun back to face the council. "Don't you see, by showing mercy instead of exercising raw power, Pyrion actually demonstrated the highest form of wisdom? He recognized potential and nurtured it instead of destroying it. The law states clearly that dragons must not interfere with developing species, but which choice showed greater wisdom? Margaret pressed, blindly following a rule, or making a decision based on deeper understanding. Which action created more good in the universe? The emerald dragon shifted, its massive form creating small tremors in the floor. You argue that mercy supersedes law. I argue that law should serve wisdom, not the other way around, Margaret said. And I think you know I'm right, because otherwise you wouldn't have kept Pyrion alive all these centuries. You could have executed him, but you didn't, because some part of you recognized that what he did was right. The silence that followed stretched for long moments. You make bold claims, human child, the smallest dragon finally said, but you have not addressed the fundamental question. If we accept your argument about the value of interaction, what becomes of our role as guardians of galactic order? Margaret felt a surge of excitement as she realized she had been leading up to this moment. That's exactly the point. Your role doesn't disappear, it evolves. Instead of being distant judges, you become active partners. You guide and teach instead of just watching and punishing. Partners with beings we have always considered lesser, with beings who have different strengths and perspectives. Margaret corrected, humans aren't lesser than dragons, we're different. We're adaptable, creative, willing to take risks. You're wise, powerful, experienced. Together, we could accomplish things that neither species could achieve alone. Pyrion stepped forward. She speaks of the old ways when dragons served as mentors and protectors rather than aloof judges. There was a time when we took pride in nurturing the growth of younger species. That time ended when such relationships led to wars and suffering. The frost dragon replied, because you tried to control instead of guide. Margaret said, because you saw yourselves as superior rather than different. Every parent has to learn that you can't control how your children grow up. You can only give them the tools they need and trust them to make good choices. You compare the relationship between species to that between parent and child. I compare it to the relationship between teacher and student. Margaret replied, the best teachers don't just impart knowledge, they inspire students to surpass them. She could feel the energy in the amphitheater shifting as the dragons considered her words. Your arguments are intriguing, human child, the central dragon said. But words are simple compared to implementation. If we were to consider such a radical change in policy, we would need proof that your species is capable of the wisdom such partnership would require. Margaret felt her heart racing. This was the moment everything hinged on. Then test us. Give us a chance to prove ourselves. Set up a trial partnership. And see what we can accomplish together. And if you fail, if humans prove as destructive and short-sighted as our experience suggests, then you'll have learned something valuable. Margaret replied, and so will we. But I don't think we'll fail. I think you'll be amazed at what we can do when we work together. The pendant in her pocket had grown so warm it was almost burning, and she could feel power flowing between her and Pyrion, a connection that seemed to grow stronger with each word she spoke. The dragons were communicating among themselves in harmonics too complex for her to follow, but she could sense the debate raging among them. Old traditions against new possibilities, the safety of isolation against the risks of engagement. Finally, the central dragon spoke. Your advocacy is compelling, Margaret Holt. But words alone cannot overturn 5 centuries of established law. We require demonstration. Reality shifted around Margaret like water flowing through her fingers. One moment she stood in the crystalline amphitheater facing the Draconic Council. The next, she found herself on the surface of an alien world that took her breath away. Sky above burned with 3 different colored suns, casting overlapping shadows that created patterns of impossible beauty across landscapes that seemed carved from living crystal. Welcome to Draconis Prime, Pyrion said beside her, his voice carrying new harmonics now that they stood on his ancestral homeworld, the first and greatest of the dragon worlds. Birthplace of our civilization. Margaret turned slowly, trying to take in the scope of what she was seeing. Vast spires of what looked like grown crystal rose from the ground like frozen music, their surfaces alive with flowing patterns of light that pulsed in rhythm with something she could feel in her bones. Cities floated in the air between the spires, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of solidified starlight. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but something's wrong." Pyrian nodded grimly. "You sense it already. The fading has taken hold here. Everything you see was once 10 times brighter, 10 times more alive. Our world is dying, Margaret, and we don't know how to save." The emerald dragon materialized beside them in a shimmer of displaced air, its massive form somehow seeming diminished in this place. "The human will witness the test that has confounded our greatest minds for 3 millennia, it said. If she can provide insight that we have missed, perhaps her advocacy has merit." They moved through the crystal landscape, and Margaret began to understand the scope of the problem. The flowing patterns of light were growing dimmer even as she watched, like candles guttering in a wind. The floating cities showed signs of abandonment, with many structures dark and lifeless. "When did this start?" she asked. "Approximately 3,000 years ago," the dragon replied. "It began slowly, a gradual dimming of our world's essential energies, a lessening of the connection between our people and the forces that sustain us. At first we believed it was a natural cycle, but the decline has only accelerated." Crested a rise and came upon the most heartbreaking sight Margaret had ever seen. Hundreds of dragon eggs lay in carefully tended nests carved from living crystal, each one the size of a small building. The eggs should have been glowing with inner fire, ready to hatch after their centuries-long gestation period. Instead, they were dim and cold, their surfaces dull and lifeless. "They won't hatch," Pyrian said quietly. "For 3,000 years, no new dragons have been born. Our youngest are already older than your entire civilization." Margaret approached one of the nests, feeling drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The egg before her was beautiful despite its dormancy, its crystalline shell carved with patterns that seemed to tell stories of ancient glory and future promise. "What do your legends say about the hatching process?" she asked. "The eggs respond to the presence of purpose," the emerald dragon replied. "They sense when a dragon has found their calling, their reason for existence. Only then do they quicken and prepare for birth." "And how do young dragons traditionally find their purpose?" "Through mentorship, through being guided by elders who help them discover their role in the greater tapestry of dragon society." Margaret felt a chill of understanding. "But if all your elders withdrew from active engagement 3,000 years ago, if you stopped mentoring and teaching and building relationships with other species, then what purpose would the eggs sense?" The dragon reared back slightly. "You suggest that our isolation has caused the fading. I suggest that purpose requires connection," Margaret said, walking among the silent nests. "Look at these patterns on the shells. They're not just decorative, are they? They're stories, histories, connections to something larger than individual existence." She stopped at an egg that seemed slightly different from the others, its surface showing faint traces of warmth. "This one's responding to something." "What's different about this location?" Pyrian moved to join her, and Margaret noticed that the egg's glow brightened slightly in his presence. "This nest lies along the resonance line that connects to your world. It has been exposed to echoes of the bond we formed through the Deathstone. The bond we formed by choosing to help each other," Margaret said, the pieces falling into place. "Pyrian, when you were mentoring human civilization 500 years ago, did you feel more connected to your essential nature?" His violet eyes flared brighter. "Yes, in those years I felt more alive than I had in centuries teaching, guiding, watching potential become reality. It gave meaning to my existence in ways I had forgotten were possible." Margaret turned to address the emerald dragon directly. "That's your answer. Your species isn't dying from some mysterious plague or natural cycle. You're dying from lack of purpose. Dragons were meant to be teachers, mentors, guardians of growing civilizations. When you cut yourselves off from that role, you lost the fundamental connection that keeps your life force strong. You claim to solve in moments a mystery that has baffled our greatest minds for millennia. I claim to see it with fresh eyes." Margaret replied. "Sometimes the solution is obvious. To someone outside the system, you've been looking for complex magical or technological causes. But the real problem is philosophical. Dragons need someone to care for, to guide, to protect. That's what feeds your souls. She placed her hand on the warming egg, feeling the life stirring within respond to her touch. These eggs sense that isolation and emptiness. You've created a world where being born means existing without purpose, so they refuse to hatch. It's not stubbornness, it's wisdom, and your solution, partnership. Margaret said firmly, real partnership, not dominance or control. Let dragons mentor willing species throughout the galaxy. Create bonds of mutual respect and shared purpose. Give the next generation of dragons a reason to be born into the world. Pyrion stepped up beside her, placing his own hand on the egg's surface. The response was immediate. Patterns of light began flowing more brightly through the crystal shell, and a warm pulse like a heartbeat began to resonate through the structure. She's right, he said, wonder in his, voice. I can feel it responding to our connection, to the sense of purpose that comes from working together instead of standing alone. Impossible, the Emerald Dragon said, but its mental voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. Other dragons began materializing around the nest site, drawn by the unprecedented sight of an egg showing signs of awakening. The central dragon appeared in a burst of displaced air, its massive form casting shifting shadows across the crystal landscape. What have you done? It demanded. We've given this egg a glimpse of what dragons could be again, Margaret replied. Teachers instead of judges, partners instead of overlords, beings who find their greatest strength in helping others grow. The egg's glow continued to intensify, and Margaret could swear she felt the presence within it stirring toward consciousness. It was working. Her theory was right. This changes nothing, the Frost Dragon said as it materialized. One egg responding to manipulation proves nothing about the fundamental nature of our species. Then let's test it properly, Margaret said, her confidence growing. Let me return to Earth. Let Pyrion come with me as humanity's first dragon mentor. Let us establish the kind of partnership I'm talking about, and see what happens to the dragon population. You ask us to risk everything on the theories of a single human. I ask you to risk stagnation and death for the possibility of renewal and purpose. Margaret replied, what do you really have to lose? The assembled dragons communicated in harmonics too complex for her to follow, but she could sense the deep divisions among them. Some were intrigued by the possibility she represented. Others were terrified of abandoning traditions that had sustained them for millennia. Finally, the central dragon spoke. Very well, Margaret. Holt, we will implement a limited trial of your partnership concept. You and Pyrion will return to your world and attempt to establish the cooperative relationship you describe. Other dragons will be permitted to observe and, if they choose, to participate. Margaret felt a surge of triumph, but the dragon wasn't finished. However, this trial comes with conditions. If your partnership fails, if it leads to the kind of destruction and chaos that caused us to withdraw in the first place, the consequences will be severe. Your world will be quarantined permanently, and all dragons who participated will join Pyrion in permanent exile. And if it succeeds, Margaret asked. If it succeeds, the dragon replied, then perhaps we have much to learn from both of you. Around them, more eggs were beginning to respond to, the energy of possibility flowing through the crystal landscape. Margaret smiled, knowing that the hardest part of her task was just beginning. 2 months later, Margaret stood in what had once been the parking lot of Cedar Valley Market, watching the impossible become routine. The grocery store had been converted into the first human-dragon cultural exchange center, its modest brick facade, now adorned with crystalline growths that pulsed with gentle light. The building itself had been expanded, using dragon construction techniques that folded space in ways that made the interior far larger than the exterior suggested possible. Pyrion emerged from the main entrance in his preferred human form, carrying a tablet computer and wearing an expression of bemused concentration that had become familiar over the past weeks. The integration of digital databases with crystal memory storage is proceeding faster than anticipated, he reported. Your human students are remarkably adaptable to multidimensional information processing. Margaret smiled as she watched a group of local college students emerge behind him, their faces bright with excitement as they discussed concepts that would have been unimaginable just months before they were the first members of the Human-Dragon Cooperation Program. Volunteers who had signed up to explore the possibilities of interspecies collaboration. Any word from the council? She asked. 3 more dragons have requested permission to establish mentor relationships with human institutions. Pyrion replied, "The success of our partnership has not gone unnoticed." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar humming sound from overhead. Margaret looked up to see sleek vessels descending from the evening sky, but these were different. From the ominous craft that had surrounded her house weeks ago, these ships gleamed with warm light and moved with graceful purpose, rather than military precision. The evening delegation, Pyrion observed, representatives from the Stellar Cartography Guild. They wished to propose a joint mapping expedition to the outer spiral. Margaret shook her head in wonder. A few months ago I was worried about whether I could afford to help an old man buy groceries. Now we're planning interstellar expeditions. The universe has a way of escalating quickly once you commit to growth instead of stagnation. Pyrion replied, with what she had learned was his version of humor. A shimmer in the air announced the arrival of the Emerald Dragon, now a regular visitor, to Earth. The massive being had taken to materializing in the expanded space behind the cultural center, where a meeting area had been constructed to accommodate both human and dragon-scale attendees. The latest reports from Draconis Prime are encouraging. It announced 17 eggs have begun the quickening process, and several adult dragons have reported renewed connection to their essential nature. "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, though she noticed something in the dragon's mental tone that suggested complications. "But I sense there's more. There is indeed opposition to our new policies has crystallized around a faction led by Destroyer Vorthak. They claim that our partnership with humanity represents contamination of dragon purity and threatens the natural order." Pyrion's expression darkened. Vorthak was always one of the most rigid traditionalists. How much support does he have? Approximately 30% of the council, plus a significant portion of the military caste. They have demanded a formal challenge to our new policies. If we cannot demonstrate clear success within the next lunar cycle, they will move to terminate all partnerships and implement permanent quarantine protocols for Earth. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of demonstration would satisfy them? Something unprecedented, something that proves beyond doubt that human-dragon cooperation creates value that neither species could achieve alone. No pressure, Margaret muttered, then straightened her shoulders. What did you have in mind? Before the dragon could answer, alerts began sounding from the monitoring stations around the cultural center. Margaret hurried to the nearest display panel where data streams from various detection networks painted a troubling picture. 27 vessels just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. She reported military configuration moving fast. Pyrion joined her at the display, his expression grim. Vorthak's fleet. They're not waiting for the council's deadline, they're implementing their own solution. The Emerald Dragon's mental voice carried urgency. This is a direct violation of council authority. If they attack Earth without sanction, it will create a crisis that could shatter Dragon Society. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Can we contact the council? Not quickly enough. Vorthak has likely jammed long-range communications until his mission is complete. Then we need to demonstrate the value of our partnership right now, Margaret said, in a way that's impossible to ignore. She turned to Pyrion. How many other dragons are currently on Earth or in nearby space? 7 are stationed at various cooperation sites around the globe, he replied, plus the research team, studying your internet infrastructure, and the cultural exchange observers. That's not enough to fight a military fleet. Fighting is not our strength, Pyrion said thoughtfully, but perhaps fighting is not the solution. Margaret felt a spark of inspiration. You're right. What if instead of opposing them, we show them something they can't ignore? What's the one thing that would prove beyond doubt That our partnership works, I do not follow your reasoning. The eggs, Margaret said, excitement building in her voice. The dragon eggs that have been dormant for 3,000 years, if we could somehow demonstrate that human-dragon partnership could trigger not just 1 or 2 hatchings, but a genuine revival of dragon reproduction. The nearest breeding ground is light years away, Pyrian interrupted, and the eggs require specific conditions. What if we created those conditions here? Margaret said. What if we turned Earth into a temporary dragon nursery, showed that our partnership could awaken new life even in an alien environment? The emerald dragon reared back. That would require transporting eggs across interstellar distances, maintaining their life support in an environment they were never meant to inhabit, and somehow replicating the resonance conditions of Draconis Prime. All of which sounds impossible, unless you have humans working with dragons to solve problems neither species could handle alone. Margaret pointed out. Pyrian's eyes flared brighter. The deep space transport network could be adapted for egg transport. The dimensional folding techniques we've developed here could create appropriate nursery spaces, and the bond resonance we've established. It would be unprecedented, the Emerald Dragon said, dangerous, possibly catastrophic if it fails, and absolutely convincing if it succeeds. Margaret replied, Vorthak's fleet can destroy our buildings and disperse our people, but if dragon eggs hatch on Earth because of human-dragon cooperation, that's a result that speaks louder than any argument. Alarms sounded again as the displays updated with new information. The approaching fleet had accelerated and would reach Earth orbit within hours. We don't have time for extensive planning, Pyrian said. This will require improvisation on a massive scale. Margaret looked around at the cultural center, at the fusion of human and dragon technology that had seemed like such an achievement just hours ago. Then we improvise. We call every dragon currently in this system. We coordinate with every human institution that's been part of the cooperation program, and we create something that's never existed before. A cross-species collaboration to nurture new life under impossible conditions, the Emerald Dragon mused. If it works, it will transform our understanding of what partnership can achieve. And if it doesn't work, Margaret asked. Then at least we'll have tried something worthy of the partnership we've built, Pyrian replied. Over the next 6 hours, Margaret watched. The impossible unfold dragons arrived from across the solar system, bringing with them precious cargo, 3 eggs selected from the most responsive nests on Draconis Prime. The parking lot of Cedar Valley Market became the staging ground for the most complex interspecies engineering project in galactic history, human. Scientists worked alongside dragon technicians to adapt life support systems. Crystalline nursery chambers grew from the ground as dragon construction techniques merged with human materials. Engineering college students found themselves operating equipment that folded space and time, while dragon mentors guided them through principles of multidimensional physics. By the time Vorthak's fleet entered Earth orbit, the first dragon egg in 3 millennia was showing clear signs of imminent hatching. Margaret stood beside Pyrian in the main nursery chamber, watching patterns of light flow across the egg's surface as the life within prepared to enter the world. The destroyers' ships hung in the sky above them like dark stars, their weapons trained on the cultural center. Vorthak is demanding our immediate surrender, Pyrian reported, reading from a communication device. He claims that any attempt to resist will result in the sterilization of the entire continent. Tell him he's too late, Margaret replied, her hand resting on the warm crystal shell. Tell him to look at what we've accomplished. The egg cracked, light poured from the fracture lines. Not the harsh glare of technology, but the warm radiance of new life awakening. The shell continued to split as something stirred within, and Margaret held her breath as she witnessed the first dragon birth in 3,000 years. A small head emerged from the opening, no larger than a house cat but clearly draconic in nature. Its scales held the same inner luminescence as Pyrian's true form, and its eyes burned with violet fire as it looked around at the world it had been born in.